Our relationship, I think at that point, things were coming down on us pretty hard, and we started to take care of each other a lot more.
Yeah. We did 72 of those.
There is a moment in television history that most people have completely overlooked. It happened live on one of the most watched shows in America during one of the most carefully monitored broadcasts in CBS history. The cameras were rolling. The censors were watching. The network executives had reviewed every single frame. And yet something slipped through. Something that nobody was supposed to see made it onto the screen, and for decades, audiences had no idea what they had actually witnessed. Tonight, we are going back to the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, and we are looking again because the first time, almost nobody noticed what was really there. To understand why this moment matters, you first have to understand the world that produced it. The late 1960s in America were not a quiet time. The country was at war, not just in Vietnam, but within its own borders. Young people were marching in the streets. Politicians were under fire. Music was getting louder and angrier and more honest. And right in the middle of all of it, two brothers from California had somehow convinced a major television network to hand them a primetime slot and a microphone. Tom and Dick Smothers were not what CBS expected. They were sharper, braver, and far more dangerous than the network had bargained for. From the very first episode of their comedy hour, which premiered on February 5th, 1967, it was clear that this show was going to be unlike anything that had ever aired before on American television. CBS had initially taken a chance on the brothers out of desperation. The network was getting crushed in the Sunday night ratings by NBC's Bonanza, a massive western that had already destroyed two other CBS programs without breaking a sweat. Executives needed something fresh, something young, something that would bring in a new generation of viewers. The Smothers Brothers seemed like the answer. They were funny, they were talented, and they had a massive following among college students and young adults. What CBS did not fully realize at the time was that in giving Tom and Dick their platform, they were essentially handing a megaphone to two men who intended to use it at full volume. Tom had negotiated creative control before the show ever went into production. That detail turned out to be one of the most consequential negotiations in the history of American television. Because of that agreement, the brothers could invite guests that other shows would never touch. They could write jokes that other writers were too frightened to put on paper. They could push the boundaries of what was considered appropriate, acceptable, and safe on network TV. And week after week, they did exactly that. Within just 2 weeks of its premiere, the show had beaten Bonanza in the ratings. Younger viewers flooded in. Advertisers were initially thrilled. And the Smothers Brothers kept pushing. But CBS was not happy. Almost immediately, the network set up a rigorous system of censorship. Every script was reviewed. Every joke was analyzed. Every guest was vetted. Every single word that was written for the show had to pass through a wall of network censors before it could reach the American public. The deadline for submitting tapes was set at 10 days before each broadcast, an extraordinarily tight window that was designed to give CBS maximum control over the brothers and their content. Writers on the show described the process as suffocating. They would write something sharp and honest, only to watch it get gutted, revised, or thrown out entirely before it ever saw the light of day. And yet, somehow, on September 17, 1967, something got through. That night, The Who were scheduled to perform on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. For anyone unfamiliar with The Who in 1967, it is worth pausing to appreciate just how explosive a presence they were. Pete Townsend, Roger Daltrey, John Entwistle, and Keith Moon were not a polished, well-behaved pop group. They were a force of nature. Their concerts were notorious for ending in chaos, smashed guitars, destroyed equipment, and an energy that bordered on violence. Keith Moon, in particular, had a reputation for taking things further than anyone expected or agreed to. He was unpredictable, creative, and completely uncontrollable. That combination made him one of the greatest rock drummers who ever lived and one of the most dangerous men to put in front of a camera. What the audience at home saw that night was The Who performing their signature song. What they did not see, or rather, what they saw without understanding, was everything that was happening just beyond the edges of the frame. Keith Moon had made a decision before the performance that nobody else in the band was aware of. He had packed his kick drum with explosives. Not a small, controlled amount. A genuinely dangerous, reckless, far beyond anything agreed upon quantity of explosive material. His plan was simple and completely Moon, and the performance with the biggest bang in the history of television. He wanted it to be unforgettable. He succeeded beyond any reasonable measure. When the song reached its final moments and Moon triggered the explosion, the result was staggering. A deafening blast tore through the studio. Smoke poured across the stage. Debris scattered in every direction. A piece of shrapnel from a cymbal struck Moon himself, cutting into his arm and knocking him backward off his stool. Pete Townsend was standing close enough to the blast that the force physically lifted his hair and knocked him sideways. The audience, which had been cheering and screaming, went completely silent for a single stunned second, the kind of silence that only comes after something genuinely shocking, and then erupted into a noise that rattled the entire studio. It was chaos. Pure, unplanned, magnificent chaos. But here is where it gets interesting. Here is where the blooper lives. In the confusion following the explosion, the cameras kept rolling. The directors were not prepared for what had happened. The crew was scrambling. And in the background of the footage, if you know what you are looking for, you can see something that was never supposed to be captured. The stage was not just smoke and smashed equipment. There were people reacting in ways that revealed exactly how far beyond the agreed parameters Moon had gone. A production assistant can be seen rushing toward the stage with a look of genuine panic on his face. A stagehand near the curtain can be seen ducking behind a piece of equipment as debris flies past. And for a brief, flickering moment, the camera swings to catch a CBS network official, identifiable by his suit and the lanyard around his neck, standing at the side of the stage with his hands clasped over his mouth, staring at the wreckage with an expression of complete and absolute horror. That expression told the whole story. It was the face of a network that had spent months trying to control two brothers and their guests, convinced they had every angle covered, certain that their censors and their deadlines and their approval processes had created an impenetrable wall of oversight. And in one moment, with one rogue kick drum full of explosives, Keith Moon had made that wall completely irrelevant. He had done something that no amount of script review, or tape submission, or network approval could have stopped, because he had simply decided to do it without telling anyone. There was more that the cameras caught that night that has been discussed in the years since. Townsend, still disoriented from the blast, reached out and grabbed Tom Smothers' acoustic guitar from where it was leaning against an amplifier at the side of the stage. What happened next has become one of the most talked about moments in rock history. Townsend brought the guitar down hard, smashing it against the stage floor. Tom Smothers, who had not been warned this was going to happen, stood watching with an expression that mixed shock, disbelief, and something that almost looked like reluctant amusement. He had spent 2 years fighting CBS for the right to put bold, rebellious content on his show. He had argued with executives, battled censors, negotiated deadlines, and sacrificed episodes to the network's demands. And then Pete Townsend destroyed his guitar without asking, right there in front of the cameras and a live studio audience, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do about it. The footage from that night did more than document a wild rock performance. It captured something true about the show itself and about the era it was broadcasting into. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour existed in a state of constant tension. On one side were Tom and Dick, their writers, and their guests, all of them pushing towards something real, something honest, something that reflected the actual world that American young people were living in. On the other side was CBS, representing the establishment, the sponsors, the political pressure from the White House. And yes, there was direct political pressure. President Lyndon B. Johnson reportedly called CBS himself to demand that the network rein in the brothers. He had stayed up through the night to make that call. His successor, Richard Nixon, applied pressure of his own. 2 sitting presidents of the United States found a comedy variety show threatening enough to personally intervene. That fact alone says everything about how powerful the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour actually was. But the network kept fighting back. Censors combed through every submission. Episodes were pulled. Segments were cut. Performances were edited down or removed entirely. Folk singer Pete Seeger, who had been blacklisted from television for nearly 17 years because of his political views, was invited onto the show in 1967 to perform a song that was a pointed critique of the Vietnam War. CBS cut the performance before it could air. Tom Smothers made sure the story got out to the press. Public outrage followed. CBS was eventually forced to allow Seeger to return, and on February 25, 1968, millions of Americans watched him perform uncensored for the first time in nearly 2 decades. It was a moment that the network had tried to prevent and failed to contain. Joan Baez came on the show and tried to dedicate a song to her husband, David Harris, who was being sent to prison for refusing to be drafted into the Vietnam War. CBS cut most of her dedication. Harry Belafonte recorded a powerful musical segment in which he performed against footage of police violently beating anti-war protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. CBS cut the entire segment. And then, in a move that stunned even the most cynical observers, the network sold the airtime that had been cleared by cutting Belafonte's performance to the Republican Party, which used it for political advertising. The time that was supposed to carry a black artist's protest against political violence was instead used to run campaign ads for the politicians being protested. CBS had not just censored the brothers. It had actively taken a side. By early 1969, the relationship between the Smothers Brothers and CBS had collapsed entirely. The network demanded that tapes be submitted 10 full days before broadcast, a rule that the brothers found impossible to follow given how current and topical their humor was. The writers, who included a remarkable collection of young talent, including Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, and a young writer named Lorne Michaels, who would go on to create Saturday Night Live, were working at a pace that the network's timeline could not accommodate. CBS began using missed deadlines as justification for pulling episodes. The brothers responded by submitting safe versions of tapes for review, then making changes before broadcast. The network accused them of violating their contract. On April 4, 1969, CBS canceled the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. The show was among the top 10 most watched programs in the United States at the time of its cancellation. The network used a missed tape submission as the official reason, but internal memos and later court proceedings made it abundantly clear that the real reason was political. The brothers had said too much, pushed too hard, and made too many powerful people uncomfortable. An episode featuring comedian David Steinberg, which had already been recorded, was never broadcast in America. It aired in Canada instead.